My video presentation of Indigenous resistance. My name is Charmaine Shouting, and this is for Indigenous studies, comparative Indigenous resistance up to 1960s for Dr. Paul Mackenzie Jones in the fall semester of 2023. So the contents of my presentation will be me giving 4 examples of Indigenous resistance, starting with the Pueblo Revolt, Haunahekes Rebellion, or the Flagstaff Wars. And then we'll look at Molly Craig's story in the Rabbit-Proof Fence, and then go into Pontiac's War as an act of resistance by signing treaties. The purpose of my presentation to examine how each Indigenous resistance act connects through a national, spiritual, and political sense, and really understand each Indigenous act of resistance individually and collectively. So starting off with the Pueblo Revolt. The Pueblo Revolt began in 1860 and is described as the Pueblo's declaration of freedom, rights, sovereignty, the right to a belief system, and to exist as human beings living in their homelands, determining their humanity, their freedom, and their self-determining and self-governing ability to exist. So before Spanish exploration, they had various independent and thriving societies that lived quite peacefully and traded within one another's territories. The revolt is said to be the only successful uprising against a colonizing power in the United States, which led to successfully keeping the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years. The revolt began when the Pueblo people began to grow tired of being oppressed by the Spanish people, the church, and the Spanish crown. The Spanish conquistadors began to come into the Pueblo territory in 1520s, and by July 1539, there was a priest called Fray Marcos Deniza who brought a Moroccan man, Estebanico, to explore the Pueblo Izuni in an attempt to find gold, riches, and a route to China, which is what they believed that North America was still at this time. So Estebanico was killed, and the priest returned to Mexico City with tall tales of the Pueblo Izuni, and this enticed Francisco Vasquez de Cornedo, who arrived and found Pueblo Izuni and was quite largely unsatisfied with the environment. But this didn't stop him from exploring for 2 years between the Grand Canyon and Kansas, searching for the riches and the gold and maybe a route to China. After he returned back to Mexico, it was about 50 years later that they decided to return and spend 80 years occupying and subjugating the land and the Pueblo people in the name of the Spanish crown. The 3 policies that greatly impacted the occupation were the Requerimiento, which was enacted by the king, which said that they're here to represent the Spanish crown and the Christian church with a heavy hand to force submittal, and if the subjugation was not accepted by the people, they are allowed to kill you, sell your children, and basically just do anything that they could to force you to submit. The second policy was the Encomienda, which began in the 13th century, forcing the Moors and the Muslims into subjugation, and allowed the Spanish conquistadors to take resources of the conquered people. And the third was Reparamiento, which basically said that they have the right to come into the land and decide what to do with it because they were given the right by God. In 1599, there was a governor, Damon Ollante, who sent his nephew to the Pueblo people to announce the policies to the Acuma people, and the Acuma people killed the nephew, and Ollante ended up sending an army to forcefully subdue the Acuma people. And with this, there was a lot of very deranged occurrences that happened, like cutting off the right foot of 25 young men, sending 100 women and children away from their homelands, and cutting off the hands of 2 Hopi men to enforce the subjugation, forced servitude, and to enact religious persecution and enslavement. Ollanta was eventually convicted of his crimes by the Spanish courts. He was charged with crimes against humanity. Throughout this whole process, 1675, there was a meeting of the leaders of the Pueblo people to discuss the severity of the society and what was happening to their people. And this is where Popeye actually decides to form a revolution and revolt against the Spanish conquistadors by collaborating with other various tribes in the area. And in 1680, the message was sent to the tribes with knotted ropes to signal that they were going to revolt in 11 days. Throughout this process, 2 brothers were caught and they were tortured, and they admitted to the revolt. And so instead of 11 days, the revolt occurred on August 10th in 10 days and was put into action and was quite successful. The Pueblo people were able to fight off the Spanish army and chase them to Santa Fe, where there was a larger base for the Spanish army to kind of just sit back and be protected. And so the Pueblo people actually cut off the water to Santa Fe, and which forced the Spanish people to leave. The area wouldn't go through the Pueblo homelands. As they left, there's 2 stories at this event which said that the Spanish people took by force a group of Pueblo people, and there's a side that said that the Pueblo people who left with the Spanish people were actually married into the Spanish culture, and so they ended up just leaving with them willingly. Anyways, regardless, there is a Pueblo establishment in El Paso, Texas, which was because of the Spanish people leaving with this group of Pueblo. And to this day, there's still Pueblo people that live in El Paso. And so this event really shaped Pueblo sovereignty and the political sovereignty and the ability to practice their own spiritual traditions and enforce the idea that they were there to stay and they were allowed to stay. And so they kind of created this sense of kinship with the people that eventually moved back and enforced the idea that the Pueblo were sovereign people and they deserved to be there and they deserved to have their own traditions and their own spiritual beliefs, and understanding that they have the ability to rise up against oppressing nature of the Spanish conquistadors. The next we will look at Hoheke's rebellion, which really was fought between July 1844 and January 1845. Prior to this, in 1843 and 1872, the Maori people and the British Army actually got along quite well through trading guns and the sex trade. Each party understood that if the other were to enact a rebellion against the other, there would be repercussions, like the British Army being cut off from the sex trade and the Maori being cut off from the guns and the ammunition, which they needed to stand their ground. After the Maori treaty was signed, there was a group of Maori people that were not really happy with how things were being played out after the signing of the treaties. So Honaheke from the Napa tribe organized the rebellion that ensued. And again, between July 1844 and January 1845, Honaheke and his warriors cut down the British flag 3 times, which challenged the British independence. And it forced the British people to become a little bit more angry with the Maori warriors and trying to establish their independence. They basically were asked not to do it again, but Honaheke and Kawati organized another capturing of the flag to really enforce that they have the ability to do this, and they were trying to prove a point that they were not a force to be reckoned with. So in March of 1845, Honaheke and Kawati organized this capture of the flag by having Kawati's warriors attack the British base in a distraction effort to allow Honaheke's warriors to take down the British flag once more. So this was the 4th time. During the battle that ensued, there was an explosion of ammunition, which really put the British in a bad position because they had no more ammunition. So they were forced to abandon the town. And the Maori warriors basically took over and set up their own base in Coraheke. Even though the British Army did come back and force the Maori warriors off the land, this was a really good act of resistance, as it proved that the Maori warriors could get band together, and it really shaped the political environment today and enforced the idea that the Maori were very powerful and they were able to stand up against oppression. And the next, we'll look at the rabbit-proof fence, Molly Craig's story of removal. And so this kind of starts off in 1931 with the Aborigine Act being implemented by the Australian government, which forced the removal of half-caste children, which is what Molly Craig, her sister Daisy Craig, and her cousin Gracie were. The girls were from the Jigalong mob, and the Jigalong mob had an encampment close to a storehouse that was ran by British people that gave the Jigalong clothes, supplies, tobaccos, rations. So while they had this encampment and the storefront, there was also the rabbit-proof fence that was being built along this area, and the rabbit-proof fence was kind of predominantly white men were working on the fence, and this kind of allowed the men to have access to the black women in the camps. And so the beginning of the movie shows the family together and being watched by the police, who were looking for half-caste children, by Mr. Neville, the chief protector of Aborigine orders, who eventually forced the girls to be brought to Moore River settlement, which was 12,000 miles south of Jigalong. The girls are stolen and brought to the camp, but eventually they escape and they walk the treacherous 15,000 miles home. So throughout their journey, Gracie is tricked into believing that her mother is waiting for her, Wilva, and she's to catch a train to meet her there. And so they did lose her, but Molly and her sister Daisy did make it home. And while eventually the girls were both sent back to the camp, I believe that this story shows a great act of resistance, just for the basic fact that these girls were able to do something that not a lot of people can do in their adult life, and stand up for what they believe in, and have the physical ability to take a 9-week trek through a desert, basically. And so this is a really empowering story that shows that, even these little acts of resistance are really important to inspiring others that may not believe in themselves. So finally, we'll look at the Pontiac Wars, or the Pontiac Rebellion, which was fought after the French Indian Wars ended. So in 1762, Pontiac convinced a group of tribes to rebel against the British because the British colonies were denying Indigenous people in the area the rights to land use, the hunting rights, and the refusal to basically cohabitate and trade. So Pontiac decided to take the Detroit fort, and eventually 4 out of 12 forts were the only ones that weren't taken by Pontiac's warriors. And this led to General Jeffrey Amherst enactment of biological warfare, of distributing smallpox blankets. It also led to the Proclamation Line in 1763, which blocked the Western expansion and colonial trade and all land negotiations except through the king. So Pontiac fought this war for 3 years, and it ended in 1766 with a peace treaty that signified the end of the wars. And I believe that this really is just an act of resistance that encouraged the people to stand up for themselves and to show that they have the power to stop expansion and colonization. And so it was really important to the Canadian Indigenous people of that area to have that sense of power and to say that they can and they will stand up if they're not treated right. So the connections that I made in this research project was really one of the things that really stood out to me was the unity that was really apparent in each of the stories, from the Pueblo Revolt allowing previously sovereign tribes to band together and to rise up against severe actions of the Spanish people, to the New Zealand warriors being able to work together. In the video that we watched on the New Zealand wars, it mentions that the Maori people were really not ones that really worked together until this time, and both of these instances really impacted the ability to work together and to kind of have a cohesive identity and the ability to say, I won't be subjugated. So this also goes for Pontiac's wars. The unity that's displayed in these wars and these battles and the revolution and the rebellions, they really show this sense of like combined efforts. I also believe that it is kind of apparent in the rabbit proof fence story, because if it wasn't for the unity and the ability for the girls to collaborate and to work together, they wouldn't have gotten as far as they did. And to get home, it really was something of a group effort. So another thing that I really witnessed in the Pueblo revolts, New Zealand wars, and Pontiac's war was the ability to enact spiritual sovereignty after the fact of the resistance acts. Whereas before the acts of resistance, they were really not able to express themselves spiritually in the ways that they deserved to and that they needed to, in the ways that they had been doing for thousands of years. And I can see how in each of these instances, it really allowed the oppressed peoples to really stand up and say, hey, no, this is something that we need to be able to do. And without the acts of resistance, I don't think it would have been carry on. Spiritual sovereignty wouldn't have been as apparent, which also brings us to political influence. So the political influence displayed in each act of resistance really is something that is quite apparent, because if you look at the Pueblo revolt, there's mention that the Pueblo people still use this act of resistance in a ways to say that they have the ability to say what is going to happen to them and not just be subjugated. Same with the New Zealand wars. There's a lot of acts of empowerment in there, and the Pontiac wars, which really shaped a lot of the ways that a lot of the treaties that were enacted in this time, and their ability to force the signing of a treaty is something that was really apparent to me. And if they had just laid down and let it happen, I don't think that there would have been as many treaties that were signed. So this is really political power that they were able to express. And with the rabbit proof fence, I feel like this is something that really is politically is something that I really feel like if it didn't happen, there wouldn't have been as much people that wanting to stand up. And it was really empowering to see that these girls at such a young age were able to do that, and to maybe encourage others to go home, and which allowed them to get out of the stolen children era. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Here are my references.